Our first unit was Westward expansion, and so the first thing we always need to get are the years. So it was 1865 to about 1900. All right, so let's move on to our notes. So this is going to be just a brief little review for state test purposes, okay? You have notes on this that give much more details and outlines and things like that. So the first thing I want us to do actually is to get our highlighters, and we're going to be highlighting some main topics here. So go ahead and highlight up here. Why not go west? Like, why didn't we go west in the first place? What was keeping us back? What a region out west called the Great Plains, what it's like. We're going to talk about a thing called manifest destiny, what changes were made that actually allowed us to go out west, specifically with technology. What are some other things out west that made people to want to go? Two very important laws called the Homestead Act and the Dawes Act. Go ahead and come up here with Transcontinental Railroad and highlight it. This little box down here where it says Manifest Destiny, Homestead Act, okay, it is definitely worth highlighting the impact all those things had on our economy. And then over here, this last little region, Native American assimilation, what Native Americans were like before we went out west, and what this word called assimilation actually means. So now we got our highlighting over with. Go back to your pens, pencils, whatever you are writing with, and we're going to be circling some very specific words here. So the first thing I need you to circle is manifest destiny. Come down here to the word, the technology. Circle cattle. Okay. Out beside gold and silver, I want you to write the word mining. Circle it. And this box down here where you highlighted everything, circle the word economy. The Dawes Act. Up here, circle Transcontinental Railroad. Assimilation. Go ahead and circle assimilation here again. Out here to the side, I want you to write the words tribal identity. Circle it. Down here, I want you to circle land ownership, not circle. You need to write this out and then circle it. Okay? So everything I just got you to circle. If you look at your standards for U.S. history, those words are specifically mentioned. And the reason that that is important is because the majority of your state test questions are going to come from the things specifically mentioned in your standards. There could be questions outside of what's specifically mentioned, but if there is anything that we need to go into this state test knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt are the words that are specifically mentioned. So we just did those. So after you get all of those circled, all right, I'm going to kind of just clean up my board here just so we have plenty of room. You got all your highlighting done and everything. Okay. I want to just run through this really quickly. Up here, why not go west? Stephen Long in 1820 was sent out west to this region, if you look here on the map, called the Great Plains. And he basically was trying to figure out why the majority of the population was remaining settled over here on the East Coast. Why were we not going west? So we sent him out there in 1820. He comes back and he says, hey, look, this region, it's like a great American desert. All right. It is wholly unfit for cultivation, which basically means you're not going to live there. Okay. And the reason that it is wholly unfit for cultivation is because there's not a lot of water. There's not a lot of timber. It's very dry. There's a lot of prairie grass, not very good land for growing food and living off of crops or anything like that. It is flat. There's a lot of prairie fires because of how dry it is and everything. So basically, it's an uninhabitable land. All right. So in this year, 1820, we are going to think, hey, the possibility of going west isn't going to happen. But then, as time progresses, the United States develops this concept called manifest destiny. Okay, and in this description, I want you to underline that this is where we felt like the U.S. should settle all the way east coast to west coast. So if you look over here at our map again, we've already got people here. We actually have a few settlers out here closest to this west coast. So what manifest destiny is, you can kind of see it labeled here on the map, is how are we going to get people to go west? So there it is, manifest destiny. Okay, how are we going to get all of this area settled? All right, that we should go that direction. Well, according to Stephen Long from 1820, we can't, okay? It's not very good land to go and try to settle. So what's going to change that? And the correct answer to that question is like, well, what's going to change that? You should have already circled it, was technology. In combination of these technologies, not just one, but all of these technologies combined, the steel plow, the mechanical reaper, both of those are going to help farming drastically. Okay, the windmill is going to help bring the source of water to the region. Come to find out, there was actually water out there. It was just mostly underground. Railroads are going to expand out west. The refrigerated rail car, which is actually in combination to the railroad, where you're going to learn there's a lot of cattle out west. So when we slaughter the cattle, we can put them on these refrigerators on trains, basically, to keep them cool, to keep the meat from spoiling. And then the mail order catalog. And the way I try to explain to my students what the mail order catalog is, I need you thinking Amazon. We all know Amazon. But instead of online, of course, they didn't have internet back then. Amazon, think of it like an Amazon magazine, right? Where you can just open up a little booklet and there's all these resources that you can order from, pay for, and they'll ship it to the town closest to you. So all of those technologies, and that is what the standard wants you to understand. Like, what impact did these technologies have on the West? Well, they made it possible to settle west. Okay, down here, other motivations for us going west. The mining. You can go out there, strike it rich. The cattle, like the Texas Longhorn. Okay, there's all this cattle just roaming around out there, free for whoever wants to go try to round them up. Okay, which kind of brings us back up here to this. They would take them on these trails, these drives, which were called the long drives. They would take these cattle on these long trails to the railroad, and the railroad would take them to a slaughterhouse. Cattle would be slaughtered, meat would be packaged, and then the meat would be taken back over here to this little blue shaded area, because that's where the people are. You got to get your product to the people so that they can actually buy it. So having all these cattle just out here roaming around, that's going to be a major motivation for people to go west. And then down here, the Homestead Act. And to kind of explain what the Homestead Act is, we're going to jump here to the middle. This is, and you need to write it, 160 acres. Anyone, unless you were a Native American, unless you were an Indian, could go out to this region called the Great Plains, and you could find 160 acres and say that it was yours. Now, technically, this is land was made available throughout the Great Plains. It's very important for you to know where this 160 acres was being given. And you would only receive the title or ownership after 5 years of using the land. So you actually just couldn't go out there and claim 160 acres for pretty much free, maybe $10. But you couldn't just claim it and not use it. That's what this word cultivation is. You actually had to use the land, all right? Important for you to note that this land was land that Native Americans lived on and used. Not only are there cattle out there, there are buffalo, which is going to be the main source of survival for many of these Native Americans living on the Great Plains. So, where these Native Americans have been roaming around out here, surviving off of the buffalo, living pretty much excluded from white settlers, well, now white settlers are going west as well, claiming their land and everything like that. There's going to be some major clashes. So, jumping back over here, we'll talk more about Native Americans here in a second. We also have the Pacific Railway Act, okay, which is over here in the top right-hand corner, if I can get to it, which is the Transcontinental Railroad. We already had tons of railroads over here because there were already people over here, but we did not have any railroad connecting all of these to the West Coast. So what we get is the government decides to pass this law called the Pacific Railway Act, which says, hey, the government's going to pay to build this railroad. They choose two companies called the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. And these two companies are going to start on opposite ends of one another. As a matter of fact, Union Pacific starts in Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific starts in California. And the Central Pacific is going to build this direction. They're going to mostly use Chinese immigrants. That is extremely important for you to write. Union Pacific is going to build in this direction. They're going to mostly use Irish immigrants to build. And the meeting point between the two is called Promontory Point, Utah. So as these two companies were building towards one another, the place that they met was in Promontory Point, Utah. And they held this big, huge ceremony, nailing of a gold spike to commemorate the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. So finally, with this railroad being built, okay, we now have all these railroads over here. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of railroad can now actually be connected to the West Coast. So we did. This Transcontinental Railroad is going to connect all railroads from the East Coast to the West Coast. And then eventually after this, we actually get another transcontinental railroad called the Northern, and then we get another one down here in the South called the Southern, and then from there we get all these extended branches. All right, but the one you got to know is this first one with the Central Pacific using the Chinese, the Union Pacific using the Irish. Now jumping back down here, gonna kind of clean up my paper here. All right, jumping down here, I want you to make sure you highlighted the whole entire thing, but the standard asks for you to know our desire to go west, giving 160 acres to people to encourage them to go west, building this transcontinental railroad and railroads spreading west was very, and here's the word, good for our economy. Okay, and at this point, after we have been together for a full semester, we've talked about what things affect our economy in a good and bad way. And just to simplify it here, if I'm sitting here telling you that this made our economy good, you can bank on it that big businesses were doing good. When the biggest businesses are doing good and they're selling and they're building and everything like that, typically our economy is doing good. I mean, think about the railroad. It wasn't just the railroad companies doing good, but everything you need to build a railroad. You need timber. Okay, Mississippi flourished during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad because we provided the companies with a lot of timber. So our economy, as far as timber goes in the state of Mississippi, was booming. Okay, the coal industry, the iron industry, everything that you need for these railroads to thrive, those industries are going to boom simply because the railroad industry is booming. So our economy is going to flourish, is going to do good. Now, strictly the rest of what we're talking about is Native Americans. Right here, the Dawes Act, okay? what it is as we went west, as white settlers went west, there were major violent conflicts between the white people and these Native Americans. We commonly refer to them as Indians living on the Great Plains. So the government kind of comes up with this plan to kind of end this conflict, to honestly get the Native Americans out of the way. They decide that they are going to choose random locations out on the plains, okay? And the term that we are actually kind of familiar with, they're going to make reservations, Indian reservations. And these Native Americans are going to be forced to relocate onto these reservations. They're going to be forced to sign these treaties, these agreements with the United States government, promising to stay on these reservations. They're not going to get off of them. And the Dawes Act is actually pretty similar to the Homestead Act. It says on these reservations, we'll give all of these different Native American families, we're going to give them 160 acres for them to live off of. And so a mama and a daddy and their kids can have 160 acres to grow food on. Problem. That is not how Native Americans lived on the Great Plains. Okay, I'm going to kind of draw an arrow over here. They believed in living changing their tribal identity. We're changing the way that their tribes operated and looked and had done for centuries. Okay, so back over here to this law again, we're trying to get them out of the way. So many conflicts between the white settlers. We're giving them 160 acres, but only on reservations, and they would receive the title and even American citizenship. But look at how many years they had to stay there. 25 compared to the 5 up here for the Homestead Act. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We made this nearly impossible. We made this nearly impossible for these Native Americans to survive on these reservations because up here above the Dawes Act, okay, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to assimilate them. All right. And the thing that you need to know is that this failed. It failed miserably. And what we mean by assimilate is assimilate, another word for it is to Americanize, to make them less like themselves and more like what we would consider the proper white man and white woman to do. So whether that's farming, whatever it may be. So before we went west, we've already discussed they lived communally. They were nomadic. The main source of survival and food came from a animal called the buffalo. And so they would actually move locations around on the Great Plains in search of buffalo. So that's what nomadic means, to roam around in search of your food or following your main food source. And of course, the traditional way that they dress, we've all seen pictures. Even the men, long hair, feathers, bright colors. They wore headgear, things of those nature. And when we try to assimilate them, again, to make them less like them and more like white society, we first try to do that with the Dawes Act, where you can no longer live communally and roam around. You have to stay on reservations. You have to work. Your individual family has to live off of your 160 acres. And things like that. Another thing that we did is we actually rounded up a lot of their children, shipped them off to schools. This one in particular, the Carlisle Indian School, was located in Pennsylvania, where we sent off children from the Sioux tribe. And when they got there, if you were in my class to actually go over this unit, we watched a movie clip from the movie Carlisle Indian School. And you can see that the boys were forced to cut their hair. They had to change their names, and some of the names that you saw in the movie clip that they had to change their traditional cultural names too were Walter and Abigail and George. So very much names that were considered to be a part of white culture and white society. They were forced to change their clothes. They could only speak English, learn English. And again, we are trying to assimilate these young people, Americanize them. And the reason we honestly targeted young people is because younger people are much more easily changed. They're much more easily, their minds are not so much set in their ways, that if there was any generation that we were going to target to assimilate, it would be them. And then as they grew older and had their own children, they would teach their children the ways that we have taught them, the white culture ways. Now, one of the issues that the American government did not foresee about these reservations is the buffalo. These Native Americans did not know how to live on 160 acres, farm their own land, poor land, to be honest with you, on these reservations, not very good for farming at all. And so a lot of Native Americans were leaving their reservations to go out and seek their source of survival, which was the buffalo. To keep this from happening, the government is actually going to do open season on the buffalo, where they're going to let hunters go out west. Many of them are going to hop on trains, go out west. When the train comes across this buffalo herd, train would slow down. Men would get out and just shoot buffalo and leave their bodies there to rot. So a lot of these Native Americans that were getting off of their reservations to go find their source of survival, they were coming up on herds and herds and herds of buffalo that were just rotting away. And a lot of the meat and the sources that they would have used were no longer going to be usable. Now, of course, the government will tell you they didn't just do it to keep Native Americans on reservations, so we are going to add this note down here. They did it, put "and" for railroads. Because, and this is true, the railroads, as they are expanding out west, there were so many buffalo, and of course buffalo don't know to not stand on a railroad track. And when a buffalo and a train collide, it's not good for either one of them, the buffalo or the train. And so a lot of people inside of our government believed that these buffalo were a hindrance on our economy, that it was slowing down trade, it was hurting businesses because of all the damage that they were doing to these trains. So therefore they needed to be eradicated, and they did almost eradicate them. The buffalo for a long time were nearly extinct because of this ordered killing of them.